Free agent offensive guard Andrus Peat has agreed to terms with the Las Vegas Raiders, taking another free agent interior offensive lineman off the market in free agency. Who is left and who is the preferred option for Miami? We explore that here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find our shows on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. I'm also the author of Touchdown Miami on Substack, long-form Miami Dolphins written content available for you all there as well. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by Monopoly Go. I'll admit it, I've got a competitive side, and it just so happens to love Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on classic Monopoly. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go now free on the App Store or Google Play. We are exploring free agency interior offensive line play here. This is kind of the content creation model of how the sausage is made. We did the deep dive on Liam Eichenberg yesterday, right? Projected to be a starting offensive lineman as things currently stand, but it's been reported from a number of different places, including the Miami Herald's Barry Jackson, that the Dolphins were in contact with a number of veteran interior offensive linemen before the draft, and the Dolphins did not draft any interior offensive linemen. So logic would dictate when we get to June 1st and the Dolphins have $18.5 million that opens up, there's probably going to be somebody waiting in the wings for the Dolphins to sign to add to their ranks to help bolster the starting profile of the interior offensive line. I do think the Dolphins are one player away from feeling pretty good about what they have up front, and it's a starting guard. I think Isaiah Wynn, you understand that there is some injury risk that is present with him. And you understand that you're probably not going to get a full season there. You're probably not going to get a full season from Teron Armstead just because that's never happened. And Teron's been in the league for like a decade, right? But you have Kendall Lamb. You have Patrick Paul, your second round draft choice. You have Keon Smith, who maybe can play some guard. You have a number of guys with positional ambiguity who could play a number of different spots. But who's the other starter? Who's the starter at right guard? Because I don't think it can be Liam Eichenberg based off of what we discussed yesterday on the show. I guess it's a spoiler for you. And I don't think it can be Rob Jones. So Andrus Peat agrees to terms with a contract with the Las Vegas Raiders yesterday. And that took another name off the board. He kind of had a short list of like 4 or 5 names. And Peat coming off the board was a name that had been linked vaguely, but not as hot as some other names. You've probably heard the name Dalton Risner, and you've probably heard the name Greg Van Roten. And we're going to talk about those guys in depth and in particular here on today's episode of the show. But the first thing I want to do is I want to go to the free agent board. And if you're watching on YouTube, you will get the visual element here on today's show. This is what I had put together before the start of free agency, and it was made available over on Touchdown Miami, but it's a draft board with free agents, and it has the Dolphins players on so that you can kind of see where the talent exists. And as players come off the board, they're signed in free agency, their names are crossed off, and it gives you this really nice visual ability to kind of see who is available, what tier of player they are. If I zoomed all the way out, this would be the full board, as you guys can see. A lot of grayed out names because the first wave of free agency came and went, very hot and heavy, and everybody signed somewhere, but not everybody, because that's what today's show is about. So we're going to zoom in here on the interior offensive line. We will do one of these with safety as well. There's a couple of different names there that would like to give a little bit of focus to, but not on today's show. We're going to go over to the interior offensive line. Connor Williams is still on the market, but the availability and health of Connor Williams kind of creates this weird limbo where it doesn't sound like there's any expectation anything's going to happen soon. He tore his ACL in December. There's been some allusions to that maybe being a more intense injury than what it was otherwise assumed. So it's difficult to gauge too much here. For what it's worth, a healthy Connor Williams would have been the best free agent available on the interior offensive line, in my opinion, of any player on the market as an interior player. The guy ranked just below him also played for the Dolphins last year, Robert Hunt, and he got a 5-year, $100 million contract. Not to say Connor would have gotten that stratosphere of money, because the guard run seemed to be particularly hot and heavy this year. But as you scroll your way through, as I have the names ranked, Onwenu, who re-signed in New England to play tackle. Kevin Zeitler signs in Detroit as a replacement for Jonah Jackson, who leaves to sign with the Rams on a 3-year, $51 million contract. Damian Lewis also signs in Carolina, 4 years, 53. So Carolina gives 2 contracts out for $153 million to Robert Hunt and Damian Lewis. Mitch Morse, who was a cut, signs a 2-year, $10 million contract in Jacksonville. Andre James never really hit the market, 3 years, $24 million. You see a re-signing for Miami as far as like the hierarchy of guys that I think grade as adequate level starters. That's Isaiah Wynn on a 1-year, $2 million deal. He gets a 1-year, $2 million deal because you know what the injury history is there, and the expectation for availability is not the same as these guys that are signing $13, $14, $15 million contracts like Cushenberry and Lewis and Andre James. Now, Aaron Brewer, graded as an adequate level starter in this scheme as a center, he's obviously already signed. The best available behind Connor Williams with the injury questions is Greg Van Roten with the Las Vegas Raiders. There's a big drop because I have him in the same bucket as Jonah Jackson, John Simpson, and John Simpson got 2 years, $18 million. Graham Glasgow got 3 years, $20 million from the Detroit Lions, so almost $7 million. So that kind of gives you an idea of, and Greg Van Roten's a 34-year-old player. We'll talk about him a little bit more when we do the deep dive. But a lot of the players in this stratosphere got definitive starting money. There were some other players who were longer in the tooth vets who got cut, like Laken Tomlinson, agreed to terms with Seattle. Brian Allen, formerly of the Rams, just agreed to terms fairly recently with the Cleveland Browns. So these guys are also off the board. You go a little bit deeper down, you get guys that are starting players, but maybe not necessarily bona fide slam dunk fits for Miami. And then you get into this weird block and chunk of players where it's players that Miami already has on the roster and then players that I have graded similarly to those players. Eichenberg, Driscoll, and Robert Jones in particular. There's 3 Miami Dolphins in kind of this 5th/6th tier of caliber players that I think are ideally quality depth players for you and not necessarily starters. And players in this group that remain unsigned include Mark Glowinski from the Giants, Mason Cole, center exclusive player from the Steelers. Lucas Patrick has some guard center flexibility from Chicago. And Dalton Risner, who is a name that is very popular amongst Dolphins fans for wanting to sign. And we're going to talk about Dalton. We're going to talk about Mark Glowinski, and we're going to talk about Greg Van Roten coming up here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins, a deep dive into these players, why I think they are or are not fits, why I would very clearly covet one in particular player out of that trio. All of that's coming up next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins, so stick with us. Quick timeout. We're going to talk more about Monopoly Go, and I can already hear you guys flag on the play, Kyle. You already talked about Monopoly Go today, and I understand that, but there's so much good stuff with this game. You need to know what you're missing out. With Monopoly Go, you can team up with your friends for time tournaments where you work together to build up each other's boards. It's not just scratching your competitive itch. The more you win together, the more awesome prizes you can unlock, and there's a lot to get, like unique stickers you could trade with friends for complete albums and get cool prizes, playing pieces to travel the boards with, and emojis for taunting your friends when you smash their buildings or heist their vaults. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. There's always timed events to help you win big, massive multipliers for everything you win, or rent frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go. So get off the bench, go download it now free on Google Play or the App Store. Game on. So let's talk a little bit about these three players that we have given their time in, or their acknowledgement of as being potential fits for the Dolphins. The first one, I'll start with the most popular name that Dolphins fans were calling for last year, and that was Dalton Risner. And Dalton Risner went unsigned into the season and then lands in Minnesota. They trade Ezra Cleveland, and Risner takes over for him. 2019 draft, 41st overall selection with the Broncos, 6'5", 312 pounds. He's going to turn 29 years old in July. So a player that's upper 20s, but came in this year and started, 11 games? He played 745 snaps. I'll quantify it that way. He played 745 snaps. And in 745 snaps in Minnesota, Dalton Risner played all of those snaps, just like he has every other year in the NFL, playing left guard. He's never played anything else. He has never taken a single snap anywhere else in his career. He is a left guard. And I think that's important context because, again, we did the Liam Eichenberg show yesterday as another player that I have graded in the same block of caliber of player as Dalton Risner. And that's where when you get into the conversation of should you sign this player or not, or is this player worth signing, or what are they worth offering a contract to? If I don't see you as anything other than somebody in the same tier as Liam Eichenberg, I'm not going to be offering you a starting contract. And that's just my perspective of the player. And if the Dolphins see it differently, it would not be the first time this offseason they've seen something differently than I have. And that's fine because they internally know what their vision is. But as I try to project what we know about the Dolphins scheme and what they want to be offensively onto the players and the resumes that they've established thus far in their careers in the NFL, Liam Eichenberg, I think, regardless of what he says and where he's most comfortable, the best tape he put on display was at left guard. And that's where he had like 600 snaps of experience the previous season in the same scheme. And I think the thought that showed up on tape. I think he's a center capable player whose best position individually is left guard. And if you're talking about adding Dalton Risner to the mix, he's only ever played left guard. And I think he is a lateral player to Liam Eichenberg. Just based on, there's some differences in their strengths, right? I think Dalton has heavier hands. I think he's longer. I think that's very evident. He came through the pre-draft process as a tackle out of Kansas State with 34-inch arms. Liam doesn't have that kind of length, and that shows up. But because he's a longer-armed player, I think he's a longer punch player. I think his strike variance as far as where his hands are landing on the frame of opposing players. I watched the last two games of the regular season. So I watched Detroit and Green Bay. And then I watched the San Francisco game, which was the first game that he started in Minnesota. So I got his first start and his last two starts in this game. And I thought in each of those games, the placement of the hands really took away from some of the punch power. And I also thought he was somebody who kind of had this overreactive base at times. He plays tall. He's just a tall guy, and it's understandable. But if you play tall and you don't have great bend, I think sometimes your base can be a little overreactive. So if there's somebody, if I need to react to a 3 technique on my outside shoulder and that 3 technique steps away from me, and I want to make sure I ride and provide a kickstand for my tackle, there's too often where I thought his hips came all the way around back with it. And then whether they ran a twist and brought the end back around inside, or if the whole line slanted, and then all of a sudden, I need to be the help for my center now, and I got to come back the other way. Now I got to pop my hips 180 degrees to come back, as compared to if there's more fluidity in the frame to kind of shuffle and slide and not give up my angles to chase contact as much. I thought those were things that stood out a little bit with Dalton Risner when I graded him. Now, you get him in a phone booth, you get him as a puller, you get him on double teams and vertical climbs. I think there's some really nice moments there. I think that's where he's an appealing and redeeming player. But he set a career high in hits, and he set a career high in pressures allowed in playing the least amount of snaps in a system with Kevin O'Connell that has some parallels in how it works to what you would be expecting him to run in Miami. And that's why, for me, I think that is a lateral player to add into your ranks versus what you already have. I have him in the same tier as Jack Driscoll, Liam Eichenberg, and Rob Jones. Mark Glowinski, the next name on this list, is 32 years old. He was a fourth-round selection with the Seattle Seahawks in 2015, so he came into the league 4 years earlier than Dalton Risner, and he has played a lot of football. He has played over 1,000 snaps in 4 separate occasions in his decade of play in the NFL between his time in Seattle, 3 seasons, Indianapolis, 4 seasons, where he got the most run and was his best version of himself, and then the past 2 seasons in New York with Brian Daboll and the New York Giants offensive scheme. There's a little bit more positional flexibility with Glowinski than there is with Risner. He's played the majority of his snaps in his career, over 5,000 as a right guard, but he has played over 1,300 snaps as a left guard as well, including 200 snaps this past season at left guard for the New York Giants. I think the thing that's concerning about Glowinski is the player he was in Indianapolis as kind of the accent piece, if you will, to what was a star-studded offensive line with Quentin Nelson and Ryan Kelly. They had some really good players along that offensive line. He wasn't asked to kind of be a stalwart player, but he was like a high floor, low ceiling type of player. Outside of the confines of Indianapolis, I think the play has been alarmingly worse. And I understand some of this in New York with the quarterback play and Tommy DeVito and Daniel Jones. It's just not been the best environment for an offensive lineman. You're playing with a lot of time under tension. But the 2 seasons that he played in New York, he was credited with giving up 11 sacks. The previous 5 seasons combined, he was credited with giving up 9 sacks. So the past 2 seasons, the pass rush the pass protection win rate and the pass protection efficiency ratings have come down in spite of playing less snaps. He only played 500 snaps this past season and was credited with giving up 6 sacks and 500 snaps. And that was only 300 snaps in protection. So that's like half a season's worth. So for Glowinski being removed from the Indianapolis Colts scheme, where he was kind of a high floor player and left to go to the Giants and was kind of expected to bring the same thing, and it hasn't materialized, that's just where I have some questions with Mark Glowinski. Which brings us to Greg Van Roten, formerly of the Las Vegas Raiders in 2023. He was with the Bills in 2024. He was a 2-year starter with the Jets in 2020 and 2021. And then he was a starter for 2 seasons in Carolina in 2018 and 2019. So 2 seasons as a starter in Carolina, 2 as a starter at the Jets, kind of a complimentary player in 2020 with the Bills, and then was a starter, played over 1,000 snaps in 2023 with the Raiders. He's taken 1,763 snaps at left guard. He's taken 2,667 snaps at right guard, and he's played 159 snaps as a center. 168 snaps as a center. 9 in 2017 with Carolina, and then 159 with the Bills in 2022. So positionally, the most flexible of these 3 players, and a player that, if we bring back up the chart, I'm kind of bury the lead here as far as what segment 3 is about. But if you go back to how the players are graded, I have Greg Van Roten a full tier, if not a tier and a half, above Dalton Risner and Mark Glowinski and Lucas Patrick and Mason Cole as the best available players. Otherwise, aside of Connor Williams up here in a quality starter caliber tier. I think Greg Van Roten is an adequate level starter player. And that's important context because that's a tier above where I have some of the other names that we're going to talk about, or that we have talked about, graded. Here's why. Raiders played in a vertical run game. A lot of gap concepts that like to run at you. But there was still an ability to climb to the second level. There was still an ability to get over top of leverage players on the second level. I thought the punch timing And the punch placement was the most consistent. I think Risner has heavier hands, but I think Greg Van Roten at 6'3" is a more compact, lower center of gravity player. I think he bends better. I think he's better with maintaining kind of that angular base to play with angles as compared to trying to take everything head on and turning the shoulders. I think the length is sufficient. I don't think he has Dalton Risner length, but he also has really heavy hands that he pairs with good timing and good placement. And that's the biggest divide between the two. I want to talk a little bit more about Greg Van Roten and then why I think he is our ideal fit to sign for this Dolphins offensive line. That's coming up next year on Locked On Dolphins. Stick with us. It's winner take all season in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, more, you name it. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Kind of let the cat out of the bag here. Greg Van Roten is the pick for me to add on to this offensive line. And the games that I watched for Greg Van Roten included a Buffalo Bills performance that was very good in pass protection, a Detroit Lions game in week 8 that was very good in the run game, and then the Kansas City Chiefs and the LA Chargers as the end of season games that I watched for Greg Van Roten. Obviously, I'm familiar with the performance that he put together against Miami because I've watched that game probably 15 times. I think this is a player who, and it's interesting to consider too from a financial perspective. I think he's played himself into a bigger contract than the other guys, like Mark Glowinski and Dalton Risner played last year for $3 million. And Greg Van Roten played for less than that this past season as well. But I think with the performance of playing over 1,000 snaps and playing at a fairly high level in spite of being a guy that's going to be 34 years old this season in 2024, I kind of think that's a little bit more of a $5 million-ish. He played last season for 1.6, and he played the year before coming off of the 2 years as a starter with the Jets. He signed for $1.047 million to play in the Bills, played 350 snaps, then left after playing 350 snaps as like a utility guy to go to the Raiders for 1.6, won the right guard spot, and was a good starting player. Like, I think he was an adequate level starter. I don't think there's overwhelming power. I don't think there's overwhelming agility, but I think he's above average in all of those things. And I think the technique is where he's kind of mastered at this stage of his career to a degree that I just don't think the other guys have. I think the other guys have maybe a little bit more appealing, specifically Risner has some more appealing physical attributes with his length, with the power in his hands, but it's not harnessed all the time. I think Greg Van Roten as a divide is you can draw a clear line in the sand and say, is this player definitively better than what you have on the roster? And the only free agent that's healthy that I think is a definitive yes is Greg Van Roten. And if you told me he signed a 1-year, $5 million contract to come play for the Dolphins with the intent of him knowing full well he's capable of playing left guard and he's capable of playing center because he's actually done it, unlike Dalton Risner, who's been a left guard for his entire career to this point in time. He could come in, provide positional flex, and be an upgrade, an actual tangible upgrade at right guard. Instead of, well, he might be an upgrade because he's got some better physical tools than Liam Eichenberg and Robert Jones, but he's never played right guard, so we don't really know what you're going to get. This is the guy. If you want the Dolphins to sign an upgrade, then the name to circle is Greg Van Roten, and you should be comfortable with paying a starter contract. And case in point, I think the contract I would point to, Mitch Morse signed a 2-year, he played center, but signed a 2-year, $10 million contract in Jacksonville. That's kind of the price point that I think that you would put Greg Van Roten on. And I think that's important, an important number to distinguish because when the Tua Tagovailoa contract gets done, and it's going to get done this at some point this offseason, and then the Xavier Howard money kicks in post June 1st, you're going to probably have $15 to $18 million to spend if you want to. Whatever you don't, you can carry into the season as operating budget inside the season, and then otherwise potentially carry it over into 2025 if you don't use it throughout the course of the season. So a significant chunk of your operating budget, if you want to add a starting offensive lineman, you're going to pay for a starting offensive lineman. And I think the only one that's available on the market that's healthy right now is Greg Van Roten. That's going to do it for us here on Locked On Dolphins, today's show. I hope you guys enjoyed another discussion into the offensive line, looking at who is available, where they've played, who I think is the best fit. We'll be doing the same thing in a couple of the positions as well throughout the course of this week and next. So you can find us on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. I appreciate you guys checking out the show. Make it a great rest of your day. I'll be back again soon to talk more Miami Dolphins football. Fins up.